Welcome to part 2 of the CSinParallel Raspberry Pi setup videos. In part 1, I showed you how to set up a Raspberry Pi for initial use based on the Raspberry Pi kit some of you got in the mail. For those of you who already own a Raspberry Pi and/or are one of our domestic participants, you should have gotten an SD card in the mail for the Pi that you have at home. To complete setup, it should suffice to turn off your Pi, swap out the current SD card with the CSinParallel SD card, and plug it back into power. If you are one of our remote participants or find out the CSinParallel SD card you received doesn't work for some reason, you will need to download the correct image from the CSinParallel website and burn it to an SD card that you already have. For that, I'm a big fan of the Balena Etcher software. I only started using it recently, but it has a really simple interface that makes it really easy for students to use. So to use Balena Etcher, you simply click on it. You would select an image. This would be the Raspberry Pi image. Usually when an SD card is inserted, this will automatically detect the SD card, and then you just have to hit the flash button. It's super easy to use, super intuitive, and I think it's really good software. So there are two ways to connect to the Raspberry Pi. First, if you obtain a micro HDMI cable and have access to an HDMI monitor and USB keyboard and mouse, you can directly connect these peripherals to your Pi and just boot it up. The other way is to set things up is to connect your Pi to your laptop using an Ethernet cable. That's the setup I'm going to demonstrate in today's video. Okay, so before we begin, we need access to two pieces of software. The first is an SSH client. If you have Linux or OS X, you already have one, and it suffices to open up a terminal and use the SSH command to connect to the Pi. Since I am doing this demonstration for Windows users, I'm going to use PuTTY. Like Balena, PuTTY is free software. It's also super old. It's been around for 20 years, but it's still my go-to for connecting to remote systems from Windows. So let's actually start by clicking on PuTTY. And what we need to do next is to type in the IP address for the Pi. In this case, it is 172.27.0.254. So we should click open. So if this is the first time you're connecting to the Pi, you should get a message like this. That's fine, so just hit yes. And then it's going to ask you to log in. So let's actually log in using the default user, which is Pi. And then the default password is Raspberry, so just type that in. And if everything worked, you should be able to log in just like so. Now, if you're comfortable with the command line, you can stop here. Typing in ls should reveal the CSinParallel directory ready to use. Now, if you're teaching beginning students who may not be as comfortable on the command line, or who might need a little extra convincing that the Raspberry Pi is actually a fully fledged computer, we recommend you use a virtual network computing or VNC client. The Pi image that you have access to already comes with VNC server installed. Next, let's download a VNC client to remote desktop in. We really like RealVNC's VNC Connect client. It's supported by multiple operating systems. Since I am on a Windows machine, you can see that it's already detected my OS as Windows, and it is ready for me to download. Once you have downloaded the software and installed it, it should be in your list of applications as VNC Viewer. Alright, so to open up VNC Client, I am just going to type in VNC, and you can see that VNC Viewer comes straight up. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new connection. So go to File, New Connection. And now we need to type in the IP address for this. So what we're going to type in is the following: 172.27.0.254, which is the exact same thing as our IP address, but now we need to include the port at which the VNC server starts up. So we're going to add :0. It's also going to ask you to put in a friendly identifier. I'm just going to put in Raspberry Pi and hit the OK button. So now this should be over here. You should see a little icon. So let's click on that. And once again, it's going to say VNC server not recognized. This is not a big deal, so hit continue. And it's going to ask you for the username and password again. So once again, the username is Pi, and the password is Raspberry, all in lowercase. Okay, so you can see that right here. And then hit OK. And there you go. We now have a desktop environment from which we can actually connect to our Pi. So we're going to just go over here. It's going to say, welcome to the Raspberry Pi desktop. It's going to ask you to set your country, language, and time zone. So since I'm in the United States, I am going to set that as the United States. And since I am in the great state of New York, I'm going to set that as my time zone, and I'm going to set these things. So if you're one of our international users, please set this according to the time zones that best match you. And so then it's going to set location. So it'll just take a second. Okay, so then it's going to ask you to change the password. So this is just for security, so change it to whatever password you like the most. Oh. Or if you're like me and you have fat fingers and you mistype, make sure they match. Okay. And it's going to ask for the screen. So as you can see, there's no black border around my screen, so I'm going to hit next. It might prompt you to connect to a network. And I am going to connect to my home network. And once that's done, it's going to ask you to update software. Okay, so if you're doing this immediately before the workshop, I strongly encourage you to hit skip because you're not going to have enough time because this update software process is going to take a while. If you're doing this a few days prior, like I'm hoping you are, you can go ahead and hit next. For now, I'm just going to hit skip. And then you should see a message like setup complete. So we can go ahead and restart our Pi at this point. So hit restart. And the VNC server has exited. So let's just close. And you can see this, this icon remains. So it's just going to take a few seconds for our Pi to reboot. You can see that we got kicked off of SSH as well. And if you're unsure if your Pi has booted, just take a look at the LEDs. As soon as you see the LEDs flashing again, all you should need to do is click on this icon, like so, log in, and if you change the password, it should be the new password now. And voila, we have a fully connected Raspberry Pi. And that's it. We're looking forward to meeting you during the workshop.